It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. So it was on a mild autumn evening in Hertfordshire that Mrs. Bennet came bustling into the small parlor of Longbourn House, her cap ribbons trembling with excitement, to find her husband settled comfortably behind his newspaper. "My dear Mr. Bennet," she said, seating herself with the air of a woman bearing news too large for patience, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet did not lower his paper. He had learned, across 23 years of marriage, that the surest way to draw out his wife's intelligence was to appear indifferent to it. "I have not," he replied placidly. "But it is," she insisted, undeterred. "Mrs. Long has been here, and she told me all about it." He said nothing, only turned a page, and Mrs. Bennet, unable to bear such composure, pressed on. "Do you not want to know who has taken it? You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. Mrs. Bennet leaned forward, her plump hands clasped upon her knee. "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls." Mr. Bennet at last lowered the paper enough to regard her over its edge. "How so? How can it affect them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," cried his wife, with the particular exasperation of a woman who has explained the obvious 100 times before and expects to explain it 100 times again, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here?" "Design? Nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that." "You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party." Mrs. Bennet protested that she had been a beauty once, though she made no such pretensions now, being a woman past 40 with 5 daughters growing up around her like a garden in need of tending. Jane, the eldest and loveliest, gentle and serene as still water. Elizabeth, quick-witted and full of a lively, questioning spirit that delighted her father and occasionally alarmed her mother. Mary, plain and studious, forever burying herself in moral extracts and musical exercises she performed with more diligence than grace. Kitty, easily led and easily wounded, always following where her younger sister went, and Lydia, not yet 16, bold, high-spirited, and utterly without the caution that might have tempered her charm. It was this last consideration, 5 daughters and no son, that gave Mrs. Bennet's nerves their perpetual agitation, for Longbourn was entailed, by the cruel machinery of English law, upon a distant cousin, one Mr. Collins, and upon his death, or upon Mr. Bennet's, whichever came later, the estate would pass entirely out of the family, leaving mother and daughters with next to nothing unless fortunate marriages could be secured beforehand. It was, in short, no idle amusement that drove Mrs. Bennet to speak so urgently of Mr. Bingley's arrival. It was necessity dressed as gossip, survival disguised as matchmaking.mr. Bennet, for his part, found more diversion in provoking his wife's nerves than in soothing them, and so he continued to declare that he saw no reason to call on the young gentleman. Even as Mrs. Bennet's voice rose in pitch and her daughters exchanged knowing glances across the room, Elizabeth's mouth curling faintly with amusement at her father's game, Jane's expression composed but attentive, Lydia openly giggling behind her needlework. It was some days later that Mr. Bennet, without any warning to his family, quietly paid the visit to Mr. Bingley that he had so loudly professed no intention of making. He said nothing of it until that evening, when, watching Kitty trim a bonnet with more concentration than the task required, he remarked idly, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Kitty." "We are not to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit him." "But you forget, mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him." Mrs. Bennet disdained to answer, but her irritation could not long be contained, and at last, in a fit of temper, she cried out against everyone who would not oblige her with introductions to strangers. It was in the midst of this that Mr. Bennet, with a countenance of perfect gravity, remarked that he thought Mrs. Long a very good sort of woman, though her nieces were plain, and then, allowing a decent pause, confessed that he had, in fact, already called on Mr. Bingley some days before, and could not, in conscience, avoid the acquaintance now. The astonishment of his family was, for a moment, too great for speech, and then it broke like a wave. Mrs. Bennet's exclamations of delight, Kitty and Lydia's shrieks of joy, Jane's soft smile, Mary's more measured observation that his conduct, while irregular, had produced a happy result. Elizabeth alone watched her father with the particular fondness she reserved for his private jokes, understanding, as her younger sisters did not, that he had never truly meant to deny them the acquaintance at all, but only to enjoy a little longer his wife's helpless agitation. The visit itself, brief and formal, yielded little beyond Mr. Bingley's evident good humor as reported by Mr. Bennet, who described him with characteristic dryness as a young man whose chief virtue, at present, was that he had promised to attend the next assembly at Meryton, and might there be examined at leisure by every mother in the neighbourhood. The assembly rooms at Meryton, when the evening arrived, were ablaze with candlelight, the long chamber filled with the rustle of silk and muslin, the scrape of chairs, the murmured speculation of mothers with marriageable daughters. The Bennet ladies arrived in good time, their gowns pressed and their spirits high, and took their places among the company to wait, with barely concealed eagerness, for the appearance of the gentleman from Netherfield. When Mr. Bingley entered, the room seemed to brighten around him. He was a young man of pleasing countenance and gentlemanlike manners, easy and unaffected in his address, his fair hair and open smile inviting friendliness wherever he turned. Beside him came his two sisters, elegant and fashionably dressed, their expressions carrying a polish that suggested long acquaintance with town society, a Mr. Hurst, who appeared to have little object beyond looking the gentleman, and, lastly, his particular friend, Mr. Darcy. It was Mr. Darcy who drew the room's attention most powerfully, for he was tall, his features handsome, his bearing noble, and it was soon whispered about that he possessed 10,000 a year, a sum that, for the first half-hour, rendered him the most admired man in the assembly. But admiration is a fragile thing, and as the evening wore on, his manners gave the report of his fortune a decidedly disagreeable rival. He danced only twice, once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, refused any other introduction, and spent the remainder of the evening walking about the room with a countenance so cold and forbidding that the ladies soon pronounced him the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and hoped he would never come again, a judgment rendered with the particular vehemence of women who feel themselves slighted. Mr. Bingley, meanwhile, danced every dance, seemed to know everybody, and was full of spirits, remarking to his friend with unguarded delight that he had never met with pleasanter people or prettier girls in his life, a sentiment that included, most warmly, Miss Jane Bennet, whom he had stood up with twice and could not cease from praising. "She is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld," Bingley declared, watching Jane move through the figures of the dance with her serene, unhurried grace. "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," Darcy replied, glancing without much interest toward where Elizabeth Bennet sat, a chair or two away, momentarily without a partner. It happened, as fate or mischief would arrange it, that Elizabeth was seated near enough to overhear this exchange, and Bingley, warm with the generosity of a happy man, urged his friend toward her. "Come, Darcy," said he, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about in this stupid manner. You had much better dance. I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with. I would not be so fastidious as you are, cried Bingley, for a kingdom. Upon my honor, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening. And there are several of them, you see, uncommonly pretty. You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room, said Darcy again, looking now more directly at Elizabeth, but there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Which do you mean? And turning round, he caught Elizabeth's eye, and finding hers already fixed upon him with an expression that mingled surprise with dawning amusement, withdrew his own, and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Bingley followed his advice and moved off, and Darcy walked away, leaving Elizabeth with no very cordial feelings toward him, though the sting of the insult did not linger long in bitterness, for she possessed a lively, playful disposition that delighted in the ridiculous, and she related the story afterward to her friends with such spirit and such an eye for its absurdity that it became, in her telling, more a joke against Mr. Darcy's pride than a wound to her own vanity. The Bennet family returned to Longbourn that night in a flurry of chatter, Mrs. Bennet recounting, with inexhaustible enthusiasm, every particular of Mr. Bingley's attentions to Jane, how he had danced with her first, then again, how he had inquired after her at supper, how his sisters had seemed, on the whole, agreeable young women, elegant in their dress and easy in their address, whatever reservations Elizabeth privately held about the coldness beneath their polish. Jane herself spoke of Bingley with a quiet pleasure, careful not to overstate what she felt, for it was her nature to think well of everyone and to be slow in declaring a preference, even to her sister, even to herself. "He is just what a young man ought to be," said Jane, when pressed by Elizabeth as they sat together afterward, unpinning their hair by candlelight. "Sensible, good-humored, lively, and I never saw such happy manners, so much ease, with such perfect good breeding." "He is also handsome," replied Elizabeth, smiling, "which a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is thereby complete. I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment. Did not you? I did for you. But that is one great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. What could be more natural than his asking you again? He must have seen that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. Well, he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him. You have liked many a stupider person." Jane laughed, and begged her sister not to be so satirical, though she could not deny that Elizabeth's wit, however sharp, was rarely unkind, and never dull. The acquaintance between the two families grew quickly in the weeks that followed. The Netherfield party returned the Longbourn ladies' visit, and Bingley's admiration for Jane became, to every observer save Jane herself, increasingly evident, while his sisters, Caroline Bingley in particular, cultivated an appearance of friendship toward the eldest Miss Bennet that Elizabeth, watching with her usual clear eye, suspected was rather more studied than sincere. Mr. Darcy, meanwhile, began, almost against his own inclination, and certainly against his own expectation, to find something in Elizabeth Bennet's countenance he had not anticipated. He had told himself and told his friends that she was not handsome enough to tempt him, but the more he observed her, the more he was forced to acknowledge the intelligence in her dark eyes, the unstudied grace of her figure when she moved, the quickness of her replies, which possessed a liveliness he had encountered in no other woman of his acquaintance. He began to listen for her opinion in company, to watch for the particular curve of her mouth when she suppressed amusement at some absurdity, though he was careful that none should perceive the direction of his attention, least of all Elizabeth, who remained, for the present, entirely insensible to it, her impression of him fixed by that first careless slight, and by a manner in company that struck her, and struck most of Meryton besides, as haughty, reserved, and disagreeably above his company. It was not long before an occasion arose that would draw the two families into closer and more prolonged intimacy. Mr. Bingley's sisters had sent an invitation to Jane to dine at Netherfield, the gentleman being engaged elsewhere that evening, and Mrs. Bennet, seeing in this an excellent opportunity, insisted that Jane travel on horseback rather than in the carriage, observing with satisfaction that the sky looked likely to rain. "My dear," said Mr. Bennet, "if your daughter should have a violent cold, she may die." "Oh, she will only get a little wet if she does not catch cold," replied his wife, entirely unmoved, and her design succeeded beyond her hopes, for Jane had scarcely been gone an hour when the rain began in earnest, and continued through the night, so that she was obliged to remain at Netherfield, having caught, indeed, a severe cold that kept her confined to her bed the following morning. A note arrived at Longbourn from Jane herself, written in a hand somewhat weakened by fever, assuring her family that she was in no great danger, but that Mr. Bingley's household would not hear of her returning home until she was better. Mrs. Bennet received this news with unconcealed delight, declaring that if her daughter should die, it would be a comfort to know it was in pursuit of Mr. Bingley. But Elizabeth, less sanguine about the romance of illness, resolved at once to go to her sister. "Whatever the state of the roads, I shall walk," she announced. "How can you be so silly," cried her mother, "as to think of such a thing in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there. I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want." And so, with a mixture of determination and unconcealed enjoyment of the exercise, Elizabeth set out alone across the fields that separated Longbourn from Netherfield, 3 miles of stile and puddle and clinging mud, her petticoat gathering half an inch of mire as she went, her cheeks glowing with exertion and fresh air by the time Netherfield's handsome facade came into view. She was shown into the breakfast parlour, where the whole party, with the exception of Jane, was assembled, and her appearance, flushed, her hem soiled, her hair disordered by wind and exercise, provoked a variety of responses. Mr. Bingley received her with great civility and real concern for her sister. Mr. Hurst merely bowed. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley exchanged a look that communicated, without a word spoken, their private astonishment that she should have come 3 miles so early in the day, alone, and in such dirt, wondering aloud, once she had gone up to see Jane, whether it did not show a most country town indifference to decorum. Mr. Darcy said little, but his eyes had followed Elizabeth's entrance with an attention he did not entirely command, noting, with some reluctance, that the brisk walk had given her complexion a brilliancy that became her. And though he listened to the lady's criticisms of her appearance with outward composure, he found himself disinclined to agree with them, a fact that surprised him rather more than it pleased him. Elizabeth found Jane feverish and unwell, and could not, upon seeing her, consider any departure until she was better, and when the Netherfield ladies proposed, with every appearance of concern, that a servant be sent to Longbourn for her clothes, Elizabeth accepted gladly and settled in to nurse her sister, dividing her hours between the sick-room and the drawing-room below, where the party gathered of an evening for cards, conversation, and music. It was in these evenings that Elizabeth's character revealed itself most fully to Mr. Darcy, and did so, ironically, through moments intended by Miss Bingley to diminish her. When Elizabeth preferred a book to a hand of cards, Miss Bingley professed astonishment that any young lady could care so little for society. When Elizabeth walked about the room rather than sit still with her needlework, Miss Bingley remarked, in an undertone meant to be overheard, upon the impropriety of a lady drawing attention to her figure by walking. Darcy, appealed to for his opinion, replied only that he could perceive nothing improper in it, and Elizabeth, catching the exchange, felt a flicker of surprised curiosity toward a man she had expected to agree with anything so long as it was disparaging of her. One evening, as the party sat variously occupied, Mr. Hurst dozing after a heavy supper, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley playing at cards with Bingley, Darcy engaged in writing a letter to his sister, while Miss Bingley hovered near him with compliments upon his handwriting and his correspondence, Elizabeth sat with her needlework, quietly diverted by the scene before her, Miss Bingley's flattery falling. One observation after another, upon a gentleman too absorbed in his letter to register half of what was said to him, and yet answering with just enough civility to keep her hopes alive. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter!" Miss Bingley exclaimed. Darcy made no reply. "You write uncommonly fast." "You are mistaken. I write rather slowly." "How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year." "Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them." "It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of to yours." Elizabeth, bent industriously over her work, allowed herself the private satisfaction of a smile, though she kept her eyes lowered, and the conversation soon turned, as conversations among clever, idle people so often do, toward the deficiencies of character, and thence to Darcy's own opinion of what an accomplished woman ought to be. "I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women," said Elizabeth, when Bingley had listed a modest catalogue of feminine graces and Darcy had promptly declared the true number of accomplished women he had ever met to be far fewer. "I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this?" "I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance, as you describe, united." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, protesting they knew many women who answered the description, until Mr. Hurst called them to order for their inattention to the game, and the conversation ended. But Darcy, watching Elizabeth's composed, faintly ironic countenance as she returned to her needlework, found his admiration deepening in a manner he did not entirely welcome, aware, as a man of his fortune and family must always be aware, that a young woman of no connections and a mere £1,000 could never be considered, by any reasonable calculation, a proper object of serious attachment. Jane's illness, though never dangerous, kept the sisters at Netherfield for the better part of a week, during which Mrs. Bennet paid a visit with Kitty and Lydia in tow, and conducted herself, to Elizabeth's private mortification, with a want of tact that embarrassed her daughters considerably, praising Netherfield extravagantly to Bingley, hinting broadly at the desirability of a long lease, and silencing, with maternal firmness, any suggestion that Jane might be well enough to be moved. Lydia, for her part, used the occasion to remind Mr. Bingley of an old promise to give a ball at Netherfield, a suggestion he received with such ready good humour that the whole family departed in high spirits, save Elizabeth, who was heartily glad to see them go, and gladder still when, Jane's health being sufficiently restored, they were able at last to return home together in the Bennet carriage, sent for at Elizabeth's urgent request rather than Mrs. Bennet's leisurely convenience. No sooner had the sisters returned to the tranquillity of Longbourn than a new figure arrived to disturb it, one whose approach had been heralded some days before by a letter, ornate in its phrasing and unmistakable in its self-importance, from a certain Mr. William Collins, the cousin who stood to inherit Longbourn upon Mr. Bennet's death. The letter, read aloud by Mr. Bennet with barely suppressed relish at its absurdities, announced Mr. Collins's intention of visiting the family, expressed in language so stiff, so laden with pompous civility, that Elizabeth could not help but ask her father what manner of man had written it. "He must be an oddity, I think," said Mr. Bennet. "I cannot make him out. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises well. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse of a sensible man. There is a fine mixture of pride and obsequiousness in it." Mr. Collins arrived punctually, a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25, grave and stately in his manner, and excessively ceremonious in his address. He had scarcely been seated a quarter of an hour before he had complimented Mrs. Bennet on the fineness of her daughters, expressed his conviction that he should see them all well married in due time, praised the dinner table, the room, even the very shape of the door-frame, with an earnestness that seemed to leave no object, however trivial, beneath his notice or beyond his admiration. He spoke frequently, and with evident pride, of his patroness, the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whose condescension in matters ranging from the furnishing of his parsonage to the placement of shelves in his closets, he described at such length that Mr. Bennet, listening with the particular delight he reserved for fools who did not know themselves to be foolish, could barely contain his amusement, while Elizabeth exchanged glances with Jane across the table, torn between mortification and mirth. It became apparent, over the course of the visit, that Mr. Collins had come to Longbourn with a design beyond mere family feeling, namely, to select a wife from among his fair cousins, as a means of making what he considered honorable amends for the entail that must otherwise deprive them of their home. His attentions settled first upon Jane, whose beauty he could not fail to notice, but Mrs. Bennet, ever alert to the more pressing claim of Mr. Bingley's evident interest, was quick to inform him, with delicate but unmistakable emphasis, that Jane was likely soon to be engaged elsewhere, and Mr. Collins, a man of no great constancy of feeling where practical considerations were concerned, transferred his intentions with remarkable ease to Elizabeth, the very next in both age and beauty. It was during this visit that the family, walking one day into Meryton to attend upon Mrs. Phillips, their aunt, encountered a scene that would prove of far greater consequence to the unfolding of events than any of Mr. Collins's ponderous courtesies. As they walked along the High Street, Kitty and Lydia's attention was caught by a stranger, a gentleman of gentlemanlike appearance whom they had never seen before, walking in company with Mr. Denny, an officer of their particular acquaintance among the militia lately quartered at Meryton. Mr. Denny, upon being hailed, made the introduction at once. This was his friend, Mr. Wickham, lately arrived to take up a commission in the regiment. Elizabeth's first impression of Mr. Wickham was entirely favorable, and remained so for some time to come. He possessed all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address, and he had, moreover, a happy readiness of conversation, a proper humility of manner combined with easy fluency, that recommended him instantly to the whole party. It happened, as they stood talking upon the street, that Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy rode by on horseback, and stopped to pay their respects to the ladies. Elizabeth, watching the two newly acquainted gentlemen, Darcy and Wickham, chanced to observe an exchange between them so remarkable that she could not help but notice it. Both changed color, one looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return, before the two horsemen rode on. What could this mean? Elizabeth was burning to know, and though civility forbade her asking outright of strangers, the mystery was not long left unresolved, for that same evening, at a card party held at her Aunt Phillips's house, Mr. Wickham was present, and fell into conversation with Elizabeth of his own accord, seeming to invite, by his very willingness to speak of it, the question she had been longing to ask. He spoke first of the neighborhood, of Meryton, of trifles, and then, with an air of careful, studied casualness, he inquired how long Mr. Darcy had been staying at Netherfield. "About a month," said Elizabeth, and then, unable to resist, added that he was a man of very large property in Derbyshire. "Yes," replied Wickham, "his estate there is a noble one. A clear 10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Elizabeth could not but look surprised, and Wickham, marking her interest, proceeded slowly, with every appearance of reluctance, as though it pained him to speak of the matter at all, to unfold a history calculated to win her sympathy entirely to his side. His father, he explained, had been steward to the late Mr. Darcy, the present gentleman's father, and had spent his whole life in the faithful management of the Pemberley estate. The late Mr. Darcy, in gratitude, had been a second father to Wickham himself, educating him, intending him for the church, and leaving him, upon his deathbed, a valuable living to be bestowed as soon as it should fall vacant. But the present Mr. Darcy, Wickham said, his voice low with what appeared to be suppressed feeling, had disregarded his father's express wishes upon his death, and had given the living to another man entirely, leaving Wickham without profession or provision. forced instead into the militia for want of any better means of supporting himself. "His behavior to myself has been scandalous," said Wickham, "but I verily believe I could forgive him anything and everything, rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father." Elizabeth's heart, already inclined against Mr. Darcy by the memory of that first slight at the Meryton Assembly, was entirely won over by this account. She declared Darcy's conduct abominable, wondered that a man could carry such pride and yet act with such injustice, and found in Wickham's story a satisfying confirmation of everything she had suspected of Darcy's character from the very beginning. The story fitting so neatly into the shape of her prior dislike that she felt no inclination whatsoever to question its particulars, nor to wonder whether a stranger's account of an old grievance, however charmingly delivered, might not tell the whole of any story. It was resolved, not long after, that the long-promised ball at Netherfield should at last take place, and the news threw the younger Bennet girls into transports of anticipation, while Elizabeth herself, though she affected a similar indifference to her father's teasing, privately looked forward to it with a specific and not entirely comfortable curiosity, for she had determined, with some private amusement, that she would ask Mr. Wickham to give her fuller particulars of his history with Mr. Darcy, and she looked forward, too, to dancing with a man whose company she had come to find genuinely pleasing. The evening of the ball arrived clear and cold, the drive to Netherfield lined with carriages, the house itself ablaze with candlelight streaming from every window, footmen in livery attending the door. The ballroom hung with greenery and warmed by great fires at either end. Elizabeth, dressed with particular care, entered the room with every expectation of Wickham's company, only to discover, with a disappointment sharper than she cared to admit, that he was not among the officers present. Inquiry among his friends revealed that he had been obliged to go to town on business the day before, a business Mr. Denny hinted, with a significant look toward where Mr. Darcy stood across the room, had been arranged rather than accidental. A hint that Elizabeth, still loyal to Wickham's cause, chose to interpret entirely to Darcy's discredit, concluding that he had somehow contrived to drive Wickham from the ball rather than face him. It was in this temper, her resentment freshly stirred, that Elizabeth found herself, not long after, unexpectedly engaged to dance with Mr. Darcy himself. The invitation came so suddenly, and was delivered with such an air of composed inevitability, that she accepted before she had quite collected her wits to refuse, and found herself, a few minutes later, standing opposite him in the set, her friend Charlotte Lucas leaning close to whisper that she hoped Elizabeth would not allow her fancy for a certain absent officer to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man 10 times his consequence. They danced for some time in silence, Elizabeth privately amused at the notion of a silence so complete between two partners, and at last remarked, with deliberate lightness, that it was Mr. Darcy's turn to say something now, since she had spoken of the figure of the dance, and it would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together. "Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing?" "Sometimes. One must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together, and yet, for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible. Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine?" "Both," replied Elizabeth archly, "for I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak, unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and be handed down to posterity with all the eclat of a proverb." Darcy, unable to determine whether he was more struck by the impertinence or the wit of this speech, allowed a faint, involuntary smile, and the conversation, having found its footing, turned by degrees, Elizabeth steering it there with deliberate purpose, to the subject of Mr. Wickham. She mentioned his name, watched Darcy's countenance change, saw the shadow of some strong feeling pass across it before he answered, with visible constraint, that Mr. Wickham was blessed with such happy manners as could ensure his making friends, though whether he was equally capable of retaining them was less certain. The reply, guarded and cold, only confirmed to Elizabeth's satisfaction the justice of Wickham's account, and she resolved to think no better of Mr. Darcy for the remainder of the evening, an evening further disturbed by the spectacle of Mr. Collins, who had discovered, to his great excitement, that Mr. Darcy was nephew to his own patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and who determined, despite Elizabeth's urgent and increasingly desperate attempts to dissuade him, to introduce himself to the gentleman directly, an act of presumption that Darcy received with a look of such cold astonishment that Elizabeth could have sunk with mortification on her cousin's behalf, watching Collins bow and bow again, and speak at unconscionable length of Lady Catherine's health and condescension, while Darcy regarded him as one might regard a curious species of insect. The evening brought further trials. Mrs. Bennet, seated near enough to Darcy to be overheard, spoke without reserve of her expectation that Jane's marriage to Mr. Bingley would soon throw her other daughters into the path of other rich men, her voice carrying across the supper table with a want of discretion that made Elizabeth blush with shame, though she caught Darcy's eye upon her mother with an expression she could not quite read, something between contempt and a more complicated, searching sort of attention that included Elizabeth herself in its scope. Later, Mary, prevailed upon to exhibit at the pianoforte, played and sang with more earnestness than talent, continuing well beyond what the company's patience could comfortably sustain, until Mr. Bennet was obliged, with characteristic dry economy of words, to intervene and spare the room further suffering. Elizabeth endured every mortification, her mother's want of tact, her sister's want of accomplishment, her cousin's want of sense, her youngest sister's want of decorum as they flirted openly with the officers, with a mixture of embarrassment and helpless affection for a family she loved without being blind to their faults, aware, with an uncomfortable clarity she could not entirely suppress, that every absurdity was being observed, and likely judged, by Mr. Darcy and his sisters from Netherfield. It was but a few days after the ball that Mr. Collins, having concluded his fortnight's visit with every appearance of satisfaction, resolved to bring his true purpose to its crisis, and sought a private interview with Elizabeth. He began with a solemn preamble on the many reasons that had brought him to matrimony. First, that it was right for every clergyman in easy circumstances to set the example in his parish. Second, that he was convinced it would add greatly to his happiness, and third, and here he bowed with particular emphasis toward the notion, that it was the very earnest advice of the noble lady whom he had the honor of calling patroness. He proceeded to detail, with a lover's lack of any actual passion, his design of choosing a wife from among his cousins at Longbourn, in order to lessen the evil of the entail whenever it should take effect, and declared, with the confidence of a man entirely unacquainted with rejection, his conviction that his addresses would be acceptable. Elizabeth, torn between astonishment at his presumption and the difficulty of refusing him without wounding a man impervious to subtlety, attempted at first to decline him with civility, assuring him that she was very sensible of the honor of his proposals, but that it was impossible for her to do otherwise than to decline them. It is usual with young ladies to reject the addresses of the man they secretly mean to accept, when he first applies for their favor, replied Mr. Collins, with a complacent wave of his hand, entirely undeterred, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. Upon my word, sir, cried Elizabeth, her patience fraying at last, your hope is rather an extraordinary one after my declaration. I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies, if such young ladies there are, who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced I am the last woman in the world who would make you so. Mr. Collins, however, remained serenely convinced that her refusal was but the delicate reluctance expected of her sex, and it was left at last to Mr. Bennet, summoned by his distracted wife to lend his authority to the matter. To resolve it with the particular deadpan relish he brought to all such domestic dramas. An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth, said her father, when she had been called into the library and the matter laid before him. From this day, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Mrs. Bennet, hearing this pronouncement, was thrown into transports of distress and indignation, alternately weeping over her nerves and railing against her daughter's obstinacy. Certain that no one would provide for them all once Mr. Bennet was dead if Elizabeth persisted in this folly. But Elizabeth, though grieved to disappoint her mother, felt only relief at her father's support, and the matter was concluded within a day or two. When Mr. Collins, his pride wounded but his resolve for matrimony entirely undiminished, turned his attentions elsewhere, closer, indeed, than anyone at Longbourn had anticipated. It was Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's particular friend, a sensible, plain-featured young woman of 27, with a clear-eyed understanding of her own prospects, who received Mr. Collins's addresses within days of Elizabeth's refusal, and accepted them. The engagement, when it became known, struck Elizabeth like a small betrayal, though she knew in reason it was nothing of the kind. She sought Charlotte out at once, unable to credit what she had heard, and found her friend composed, even satisfied, entirely unmoved by any suggestion that she had acted against her own happiness. "I am not romantic, you know," said Charlotte, with the calm practicality that had always distinguished her. "I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." Elizabeth, though she could not argue with the truth of Charlotte's circumstances, a woman of small fortune, no great beauty, and 27 years already behind her, for whom marriage represented not romance, but simple, necessary security, felt nonetheless a private grief at the thought of her friend bound for life to a man so entirely without sense or feeling, and reflected, with the particular clarity of a young woman who had not yet been forced to weigh her own prospects so coldly, that she would never have supposed it possible that Charlotte could sacrifice every better feeling to worldly advantage. It was a first, quiet lesson in the harder arithmetic that governed so many marriages of her acquaintance, and it did not sit easily with her. Scarcely had this settled into the ordinary business of Longbourn's gossip when a far heavier blow fell upon the household, one that struck at Jane's happiness directly, and, through Jane, at Elizabeth's own peace of mind. A letter arrived from Miss Bingley, addressed to Jane, announcing that the whole party had quit Netherfield for London, with no present intention of returning. The letter, written in terms of great affection and dwelling with pointed warmth upon the beauty and accomplishments of Mr. Darcy's sister, Georgiana, concluded with an expression of hope, delivered as though it were already a settled thing, that her brother might form an attachment to Miss Darcy, an alliance both families, Miss Bingley implied, would be delighted to see accomplished. Jane read the letter with outward composure, but the color that rose and fell in her cheeks, and the effort with which she strove afterward to speak of the matter without visible distress, told Elizabeth all she needed to know of her sister's true feelings. Jane would not, even to herself, admit disappointment. She reasoned, with her habitual generosity, that Miss Bingley's affection for her was perhaps sincere even if her brother's intentions had been mistaken by everyone, including Jane, and resolved to think no ill of anybody, to hope for the best, and to bear whatever came with quiet dignity. Elizabeth, less charitable and considerably more suspicious, believed Miss Bingley's design to be exactly what it appeared, an attempt to separate her brother from an attachment his sister considered beneath the family's ambitions, and privately laid a portion of the blame, though she could not yet prove it, at the door of Mr. Darcy, whom she suspected of encouraging his friend's removal for reasons of pride respecting the very connections Miss Bingley had been so careful to disparage. Through the weeks that followed, Jane bore her disappointment with a composure so complete that even Elizabeth, watching her closely, could discern little outward change, save a certain thoughtfulness that had not been there before. A quietness at moments when the conversation turned toward balls, or Netherfield, or the officers who had once filled Meryton's assemblies with gaiety. Mrs. Bennet lamented Bingley's departure loudly and often, blaming everyone in turn for the loss of so eligible a match, while Mr. Bennet observed the whole business with his customary detachment, remarking only that young men of large fortune were forever falling in and out of love, and that it was as well Jane had a sister clever enough not to break her heart over so fickle a species. It was in this interval, too, that Elizabeth's understanding of Mr. Wickham's history received a curious complication, not yet a full correction, but a small crack in the smoothness of the story she had accepted so readily when it emerged, through the gossip of the neighborhood and a chance remark or two from those who claimed fuller knowledge, that opinions on Mr. Darcy's character were not so uniformly damning as Wickham's account had suggested. Some acquaintances of the Darcy family recalling him as a young man of great pride, certainly, but of unimpeachable honor in matters of business and inheritance. Elizabeth set the inconsistency aside for the present, unwilling to relinquish a version of events that so satisfyingly confirmed her dislike, and continued, through the long grey weeks of a Hertfordshire winter, to find in Wickham's company, still frequent, still charming, a pleasant distraction from the disappointments that had settled over her sister's prospects. The wedding of Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas took place not long after, conducted with the brisk efficiency of two people who had entered upon the arrangement with clear eyes and modest expectations, and Charlotte, before departing for Kent to take up residence at Hunsford Parsonage, extracted from Elizabeth a promise, pressed with more earnestness than Charlotte generally displayed, that her friend would visit her there before too many months had passed. Elizabeth gave the promise readily enough, though with an inward reluctance she did not entirely examine, uncertain whether she looked forward more to the pleasure of Charlotte's company or dreaded more the prospect of witnessing, at close quarters, the particular domestic arrangement her friend had chosen to call happiness. Winter passed into a mild and uneventful spring at Longbourn, the household settling into its accustomed rhythms once more, though a certain flatness had crept over the neighborhood's gaiety since the departure of the Netherfield party, and Jane, though she never complained, seemed to Elizabeth's watchful eye a shade quieter than she had been the autumn before, a small, private sorrow carried gracefully and spoken of to no one, not even to the sister who saw it most clearly. It was Elizabeth's own turn at length to travel, first a short stay in London with her aunt and uncle Gardiner, sensible, affectionate relations whose company she prized above almost any other, and then, as the appointed time drew near, onward into Kent, to fulfill at last the promise she had made to Charlotte, and to see with her own eyes the parsonage at Hunsford and the great house of Rosings beyond it, where Lady Catherine de Bourgh presided in state, and where, though Elizabeth could not yet have guessed it, her own history was about to take a turn she had never thought to anticipate. She packed her trunk on a bright morning with more curiosity than reluctance now that the hour had actually come, embraced her father, who told her with dry affection that he should miss his cleverest daughter's conversation at breakfast, endured her mother's final flurry of instructions regarding gowns and gloves and the proper behavior due to a titled lady's condescension, and climbed at last into the carriage that would carry her toward Kent, toward Hunsford, and toward Charlotte's quiet, purposeful marriage, the fields of Hertfordshire falling away behind her in the pale spring light, and ahead, unknown and unlooked for, whatever awaited her at the end of the road. The road to Kent unwound through a countryside just beginning to green with the first true warmth of spring, hedgerows softening with new leaf, the fields beyond them turned and sown, and Elizabeth, watching the flat Hertfordshire lanes give way gradually to the gentler hills of Kent, found her spirits rising with a curiosity she had not quite expected to feel. She had broken her journey, as arranged, with a night in London at her uncle Gardiner's comfortable house in Grassetchage Street, where her aunt, a woman of good sense and real affection whom Elizabeth loved as much as any relation she possessed, had spoken with her long and warmly of the family's plans for a summer tour that was to take them, before the year was out, into the northern counties, a scheme Elizabeth had received with more enthusiasm than she generally showed for anything so distant, delighting in particular at the mention of Derbyshire, that country of hills and rivers she had always wished to see. From London the road carried her onward, in company now with Sir William Lucas and his younger daughter Maria, who talked without ceasing of the honor they were about to receive in being admitted, however briefly, to the notice of so great a lady as Lady Catherine de Bourgh, until at last, as the afternoon light began to slant long and golden across the fields, the carriage turned in at a trim white gate, and there, coming down the short gravel walk with her arms already open, was Charlotte. She looked well, rounder in the face perhaps, and settled in her bearing in a way that spoke of a woman comfortably arranged in her circumstances, and she embraced Elizabeth with a warmth that dissolved, in an instant, whatever awkwardness might have lingered between them since the engagement. The parsonage itself was a modest, well-proportioned house, its garden laid out with the particular neatness of a man who took excessive pride in small achievements, gravel paths raked to a fault, a shrubbery clipped with obsessive precision, and beyond the garden, visible through a break in the trees, the pale stone chimneys of a much greater house rising above its own park, Rosings, Charlotte explained, home to Lady Catherine herself, and a presence that governed, Elizabeth would soon discover, nearly every hour of life at Hunsford. Mr. Collins received his cousin with all his old ceremony, augmented now by the particular pride of a man displaying his own establishment for the first time, walking her through every room of the small house with a commentary so thorough that he did not neglect to point out the very shelves in the closets, built, he assured her, according to a suggestion once offered by Lady Catherine herself during a visit of great condescension the previous autumn. He led them, before dinner was half done digesting, out into the garden to admire the view toward Rosings Park, framed, he explained with the reverence of a man gesturing toward a shrine, by the very avenue down which Lady Catherine's carriage passed each day. And Elizabeth, watching Charlotte move through this recitation with an expression of unruffled calm, began to understand the particular art her friend had mastered in the months of her marriage, an art of quiet, practical management, by which she encouraged her husband's long absences in the garden, arranged the rooms of the house so that his library, where he spent much of his time, faced away from the road and its distractions, and bore, with a composure that struck Elizabeth as both admirable and faintly sad, the small daily indignities of a marriage entered upon without love, but managed, none the less, with considerable good sense. "I am not sorry that I did not come with you today," Charlotte told her, in a quiet moment as they walked together in the garden that first evening, the sky above them turning the soft violet of approaching dusk. "One grows accustomed to a great many things, Eliza, when one has a comfortable home and an income to depend upon, and I find I can be very content, watching my husband happy in his little concerns, and keeping my own thoughts to myself." Elizabeth pressed her friend's hand, unable to find words that would neither wound Charlotte's pride nor betray her own private reservations, and reflected, not for the first time, that happiness took many shapes, not all of them the shape she herself would have chosen. Though whether Charlotte's particular arrangement deserved the name of happiness at all remained, in Elizabeth's private judgment, a question she preferred not to press too closely. Words soon came, delivered by Mr. Collins with an excitement he could barely contain, that they were commanded to dine at Rosings in honor. He assured them repeatedly as he fussed over the fit of his coat and rehearsed, half aloud, the manner in which he ought to address her ladyship, that few clergymen of his acquaintance had received with such frequency, and one that demanded the very greatest attention to dress and deportment. Maria Lucas, overwhelmed at the prospect, could speak of nothing else, wondering aloud whether she should be able to say a single word in so great a lady's presence, while Elizabeth, amused by the general agitation but not entirely immune to her own curiosity, found herself more curious than intimidated as the appointed hour approached. Rosings, when they arrived, proved every bit as grand as Mr. Collins's descriptions had promised, and grander, indeed, than Elizabeth's private skepticism had allowed her to expect. A handsome, modern building set upon rising ground, its many windows catching the last of the daylight, the rooms within furnished with a splendor that spoke of very considerable wealth, marble chimney pieces and gilt-framed mirrors and carpets so fine that Mr. Collins, walking through the hall, could not help but pause to admire the cost of things with an appraising eye that Elizabeth found, despite herself, faintly comic. Lady Catherine received them in a large drawing-room, seated with the particular composed dignity of a woman entirely accustomed to command, a tall, imposing figure whose strongly marked features suggested that she had once been handsome, and whose manner was not so much rude as simply certain of its own supreme authority in every matter, great or small. She questioned Elizabeth with the freedom of a woman entirely unused to being refused an answer, inquiring into the number and ages of her sisters, whether they were out in society, whether her mother kept a governess, the value of her father's estate, the state of the roads from Hertfordshire, and even, at one point, the particulars of the family carriage. And Elizabeth, though she answered with civility, could not entirely suppress a private amusement at questions so pointed, so entirely, without the softening of ordinary tact, delivered in a voice that assumed compliance as its due. "Do any of your younger sisters come out before the elder are married?" Lady Catherine demanded, settling back in her chair. "Yes, all," said Elizabeth. "The younger ones all out at once." "What, all 5 out at once? Very odd. And you only the second?" "The younger ones out before the elder are married." "Your younger sisters must be very young." "My youngest is not 16. Perhaps she is full young to be much in company. But really, ma'am, I think it would be very hard upon younger sisters that they should not have their share of society and amusement, because the elder may not have the means or inclination to marry early." Lady Catherine, unaccustomed to being answered rather than merely agreed with, regarded her for a moment with an expression that mingled surprise and a certain grudging attention, before turning the conversation to other matters. The impertinence of allowing so many daughters into society at once, her own opinions on the proper education of young women, her firm conviction that she herself, had circumstances permitted, would have been a considerable proficient upon the pianoforte delivered throughout dinner and after with an authority that brooked no contradiction, while Mr. Collins murmured his agreement to every pronouncement with such fervent regularity that Elizabeth wondered he found breath enough between compliments to eat his dinner at all. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, walks about the parsonage garden and the lanes beyond, the occasional summons to Rosings, Mr. Collins's ceaseless small attentions to his patroness's comfort, Charlotte's calm management of her household. Until, some fortnight into Elizabeth's visit, word arrived that threw the parsonage into a fresh flurry of anticipation. Lady Catherine's nephew, Mr. Darcy, was expected at Rosings, together with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, son to an earl, and a young man of pleasing manners whom Elizabeth would come to like a great deal in the weeks ahead. Elizabeth's first sight of Mr. Darcy since the Netherfield ball came a few days after his arrival, when he called at the parsonage with Colonel Fitzwilliam in company, a visit that surprised her, for she had not expected him to trouble himself with so short an acquaintance, and she found, watching him across the small parlor, that he seemed changed, or perhaps only that she had never before had leisure to observe him so closely without the distraction of a crowded room. He said little at first, sitting somewhat apart, his gaze returning to her with a frequency that Charlotte, ever observant, noted with private interest, while Colonel Fitzwilliam, easy and well-bred, entertained the room with cheerful conversation, inquiring after Elizabeth's family, her journey, her opinion of Kent, with the natural friendliness of a man who found conversation with an intelligent woman a pleasure rather than a duty. It was at Rosings, some days later, that the acquaintance deepened further, for Colonel Fitzwilliam, seated beside Elizabeth at the pianoforte while she played for the company, fell into an easy, teasing conversation that Darcy, standing near enough to overhear, seemed unable to keep himself from joining. "Your cousin will tell you that I play very ill," Elizabeth said to the Colonel, glancing toward Darcy with the particular archness she reserved for him alone, "but the fault, I assure you, is entirely my own want of practice, and not, as some might have it, any deficiency of instruction." "I shall not be alarmed," Darcy replied, coming closer, that you mean to frighten me by supposing my opinion of any consequence. I know your love of professing opinions which are not your own." Elizabeth laughed, delighted at the opening this gave her, and turned to the colonel with mock gravity. "Your cousin will paint me a very dreadful creature, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and teach you not to believe a word I say. I am particularly unlucky in meeting a person so able to expose my real character in a part of the world where I had hoped to pass myself off with some degree of credit." "I am not afraid of you," said Darcy, and something in his tone, quieter and more direct than his usual reserve, made Elizabeth glance up at him with a flicker of surprise. She pressed her advantage, half in jest, reminding him of his conduct at that first Meryton assembly, when he had danced not a single dance though gentlemen were scarce and more than one young lady sat without a partner, and Darcy, to her further surprise, did not retreat behind his old cold reserve, but answered with something almost like humility, confessing that he had not, at that time, the honor of any acquaintance in the room, and that he had never possessed the talent, which he admired, in others, of conversing easily with those he had never seen before. "My fingers," said Elizabeth, turning back to the keys, "do not move over this instrument in the masterly manner which I see so many women's do. They have not the same force or rapidity, and do not produce the same expression. But then I have always supposed it to be my own fault, because I would not take the trouble of practicing." "You are perfectly right," said Darcy. "You have employed your time much better. No one admitted to the privilege of hearing you can think anything wanting." It was a compliment so unlike anything she had ever received from him that Elizabeth scarcely knew how to answer it, and covered her confusion by returning to her playing, though she was conscious, for the remainder of the evening, of his eyes upon her with an attention she found she could no longer entirely dismiss as mere haughty indifference. The visits between Rosings and the parsonage grew more frequent as the days passed. Colonel Fitzwilliam called often, and Elizabeth found in him a companion whose easy good humor and genuine interest in her opinions made him excellent company, but it was the change in Mr. Darcy that occupied her thoughts more, though she could not, for some while, account for it. He called at hours that seemed to have no particular object, sat for long stretches in near silence, and yet seemed reluctant to take his leave. He sought her out on her solitary walks through the park's quiet groves, a favorite haunt of hers that she had believed known to no one else, until she encountered him there so often that she began to suspect the meetings were not entirely the accident they appeared. It was on one such walk, the colonel her companion this time rather than Darcy, that Elizabeth learned something which altered, in an instant, the whole complexion of her feelings toward the coming weeks. They had fallen into conversation about Mr. Bingley, whom the colonel mentioned in passing as an old friend of his cousin's, and Elizabeth, seizing the opening with more eagerness than she perhaps ought to have shown, asked whether Mr. Darcy was in the habit of managing his friends' affairs for them. "He rather gives himself the credit of it, I believe," said Colonel Fitzwilliam with easy candor. "He congratulated himself, only a few weeks ago, on having lately saved a friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage." "Did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for this interference?" "I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady." Elizabeth's heart had begun, by this point, to beat with a rapidity she strove hard to conceal, for though the colonel named no names, she could not doubt, not for one moment, whose happiness had been so casually discussed and so deliberately overturned. And she walked the remainder of the path in a silence so charged with suppressed feeling that she was glad, when at last they parted, to be alone, to let the anger she had been holding in check break freely across her thoughts. That it was Darcy who had separated Bingley from Jane she no longer doubted, that his interference had been undertaken, in part, from a pride that could not tolerate connections he considered beneath his friend's family, she felt certain. And she carried this fresh injury with her back to the parsonage, her mind turning it over and over with a bitterness that left her, by the time she reached her room, in a state of real agitation, glad of the excuse of a headache to excuse herself from the day's engagement at Rosings. She had scarcely settled into the solitude of the empty parsonage, the rest of the party gone ahead to dine, when a ring at the bell startled her, and she looked up, astonished, to find Mr. Darcy himself entering the room, alone. His manner agitated in a way she had never before observed in him. He inquired after her health with obvious concern, and then, after a turn or two about the room in evident struggle with himself, came suddenly to a stop before her and began to speak. In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Elizabeth stared at him, too astonished for speech, color rushing into her face as he went on speaking not only of his admiration, but, with what struck her as a one of feeling rather than an excess of it, of the many obstacles his judgment had set against the attachment, her family's inferior connections, the impropriety of her mother's conduct, the want of fortune, the degradation, as he termed it, that such a match must represent for a man of his standing, all delivered with an earnestness that seemed to expect, even amid such admissions, a grateful and immediate acceptance. When at last he fell silent, awaiting her answer with a countenance that betrayed no doubt of the outcome, Elizabeth found her voice, and found it steadier than she had any right to expect, given the tumult within her. In such cases as this, I believe the established mode is to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you. But I cannot. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I am sorry to have occasioned pain to anyone. It has been most unconsciously done, however, and I hope will be of short duration. Darcy's countenance changed, color and astonishment both visible upon it, and he pressed her, when he could command himself to speak, to know the meaning of so decided a rejection. I might as well inquire, replied Elizabeth, her own anger rising now to meet his astonishment, why, with so evident a design of offending and insulting me, you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character? Was not this some excuse for incivility if I was uncivil? But I have other provocations. You know I have. Had not my own feelings decided against you, had they been indifferent, or had they even been favorable, do you think that any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister? She saw him grow pale as she spoke, but did not relent, laying before him the whole of her grievance, his part in dividing Bingley from Jane, whatever the true nature of it, and, with a heat she could not restrain, the injury done to Mr. Wickham, whose history she now recounted, believing every word of it still, as evidence of a character she had long suspected beneath his pride. "Can you deny that you have done it?" she demanded. "I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success. Towards him I have been kinder than towards myself." And then, when she turned from this to the matter of Wickham, his composure broke entirely, and he spoke with a bitterness she had not before seen in him of the true history between himself and that gentleman, a history, he insisted, entirely opposite to the one she had been told, though he offered no particulars in that moment, only a proud, wounded assertion that she had judged him with a readiness that owed more to her prejudice than to any real knowledge of the facts. "You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it," Elizabeth told him, her voice unsteady now with the force of her own feeling. "From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressed me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form the groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike, and I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness." And with that he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that left Elizabeth standing alone in the small parlor, trembling from head to foot with the aftermath of so violent a scene, weeping now that no one remained to witness it, Overwhelmed by a confusion of feeling, she could not for some time untangle anger at his pride, astonishment at the strength of the attachment he had professed, and, beneath it all, a disquiet she could not immediately name, as though some of her own certainties had been shaken loose by the force of the encounter, though she was not yet ready to examine which. She spent a restless night, and rose the next morning still agitated, seeking the solitude of her favorite grove to walk off some part of her disturbed feelings, when she encountered, to her considerable dismay, Mr. Darcy himself, walking toward her with a letter in his outstretched hand, which he begged her, with a grave, controlled civility that gave no hint of the previous evening's passion, to do him the honor of reading. He did not wait for her answer, but turned and was gone among the trees before she had recovered her composure enough to reply, leaving her standing alone with the folded pages in her hand. She broke the seal at last, and began to read, and continued reading, walking slowly along the path, then stopping altogether to give the letter her full attention, then reading it again from the beginning, so urgent was her need to comprehend what it contained. He wrote first, at some length, of the matter of Bingley and Jane, acknowledging freely that he had persuaded his friend against the match, but explaining, with a candor that startled her, his reasons. Not merely the objections of family and connection that he had voiced so tactlessly the night before, but a conviction, formed from careful observation, that Jane's composure of manner, however sincere her feelings might in fact have been, gave no outward sign of any decided preference for Bingley, such that Darcy had honestly believed, and still half believed, that he had spared his friend from an unrequited attachment rather than a mutual one. Of this Elizabeth read with a confusion of feeling, anger at the interference, but a grudging, uncomfortable acknowledgment that Jane's reserve might indeed have misled a stranger, however it had never misled her own family. It was the second matter, however, the history of Mr. Wickham, that struck her with far greater force. Darcy wrote of it with evident pain, but with a thoroughness of detail that carried, even to Elizabeth's reluctant eye, the unmistakable weight of truth. Wickham's father had indeed been steward at Pemberley, and the elder Mr. Darcy had indeed been fond of the young man, providing for his education and intending the living for him as Wickham had claimed, but Wickham himself, Darcy wrote, had been from his youth a young man of loose principles and vicious habits, concealed with great care from all but those nearest him, and upon the elder Mr. Darcy's death, had renounced all claim to the church living in exchange for a sum of £3,000, declaring his intention of studying the law, a sum he had spent within a very few years in idleness and dissipation, before returning to demand the living after all, upon the death of the incumbent, a demand Darcy had naturally refused. Given Wickham's earlier renunciation of it, and given, moreover, character since fallen into circumstances of considerable degradation and vice. And then, in a passage Elizabeth read with a horror that drove the blood from her face, Darcy disclosed a private history he confessed he would not have revealed but for the necessity of defending himself, that the previous summer Wickham had attempted to persuade Darcy's own sister, Georgiana, then but 15 years old and staying at Ramsgate under the care of a companion who proved, it emerged, to be secretly in Wickham's confidence, into an elopement, his object being nothing more nor less than her considerable fortune of £30,000 and the further satisfaction of revenge against her brother, a scheme discovered and prevented only by Darcy's own unexpected arrival, a day or two before the elopement was to take place. An intervention that had spared Georgiana untold misery, but had left her, Darcy wrote with evident and restrained anguish, deeply wounded by the deception practiced upon her by a man she had trusted as almost a brother. Elizabeth read this passage twice, then a third time, her hands unsteady, her mind refusing at first to relinquish the picture of Wickham she had so readily accepted, charming, wronged, honest in his grievance, in favor of this darker portrait. But the very particularity of the account, its consistency with details she herself had half noticed and dismissed, the absence in it of any of the self-serving vagueness that had characterized Wickham's own tale, forced upon her, by degrees, a reluctant and increasingly complete conviction of its truth. She recalled, with a fresh mortification, how readily she had believed Wickham's story upon a single evening's acquaintance, how she had repeated it about the neighborhood without a shred of actual proof, how she had judged Darcy's coldness toward Wickham at the Meryton Assembly as evidence of guilt rather than, as now appeared far more likely, a proud man's disgust at being obliged to acknowledge, in public, an acquaintance he had every reason to despise. "How despicably I have acted," she cried aloud, alone upon the path, the letter trembling in her hands. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery! Yet, how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance and driven reason away, where either were concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself." She walked back to the parsonage in a state of mind entirely altered from that in which she had set out, her old certainties dismantled, her pride in her own judgment thoroughly humbled, and though she said nothing of the letter's contents to Charlotte, she carried its weight with her through the remaining days of her visit, days made only more awkward by the necessity of one further, brief and painfully formal leave-taking from Mr. Darcy before his own departure from Rosings, an encounter conducted on both sides with a strained civility that gave neither of them any comfort, though Elizabeth thought she perceived, beneath his reserve, something of the same unresolved feeling that troubled her own thoughts. Her return journey to Hertfordshire, made once more in company with Maria Lucas, passed with a curious quiet, Elizabeth's mind occupied so entirely by the events of the past fortnight that she scarcely attended to the changing scenery. And it was with genuine relief that she found herself, at length, welcomed back into her aunt and uncle's house in London for a short stay before continuing on to Longbourn, where she was received by her family with all the noisy affection of home, Kitty and Lydia full of militia gossip, her mother full of complaints, her father full of dry, affectionate teasing at her expense. It was to Jane alone, once they had a private hour together, that Elizabeth at last unburdened herself of the true history of Mr. Darcy's proposal, and of the letter that had followed it, watching her sister's gentle countenance move through astonishment, distress on Elizabeth's behalf, and, at the revelation of Wickham's true character, a pained reluctance to believe ill of anyone that only slowly gave way before the weight of the evidence Elizabeth laid before her. "This is quite a new circumstance," said Jane at last, troubled. "Wickham's so very bad. It is almost past belief. And poor Mr. Darcy. Dear Lizzie, only consider what he must have suffered." "Oh, no, my regret and compassion are all done away with by seeing you so full of both. I know you will do him such ample justice, that I am growing every moment more unconcerned and indifferent. Your profusion makes me saving, and if you lament over him much longer, my heart will be as light as a feather." They agreed between them, after much discussion, that Wickham's true character should be quietly disclosed to their father, and to the neighborhood at large in general terms, sufficient to guard against any real harm, but without exposing in full detail the painful particulars concerning Georgiana Darcy, a confidence Elizabeth felt bound to protect, and with this settled, the sisters turned to lighter matters, though Elizabeth found her thoughts returning, more often than she cared to admit, to the strange, unresolved feelings that Hunsford had left unsettled within her. The militia, meanwhile, was under orders to remove from Meryton to Brighton for the summer, a piece of news that threw Lydia and Kitty into transports of anxiety and longing. Lydia in particular declaring that she could not live without seeing the officers again, and begging, with all the vehemence of a girl of 16 accustomed to having her wishes indulged, that the family might take a house at Brighton for the season, or that she at least might be permitted to accompany the colonel's wife, who had been kind enough to invite her as a particular friend. Elizabeth, watching her youngest sister's excitement with real alarm, ventured to warn her father of the danger such an unsupervised excursion might pose to a girl of Lydia's temperament, wild, unguarded, entirely without the discretion that circumstances demanded. But Mr. Bennet, ever inclined to take the path of least present trouble, waved away her concerns with his usual detached humor. Observing that Lydia would never be easy till she had exposed herself in some public place or other, and that they could never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience to her family as under the present circumstances. It was with this decision made, and Lydia's departure for Brighton accomplished amid a great bustle of new bonnets and higher spirits than the occasion perhaps warranted, that Elizabeth herself set out, not long after, upon the summer tour she had so long anticipated, in the company of her aunt and uncle Gardiner, a scheme originally intended to range as far as the lakes, but curtailed by business that recalled Mr. Gardiner sooner than expected, so that their travels were confined instead to Derbyshire, a change of plan Elizabeth accepted with no real disappointment, for it was Derbyshire, after all, that she had most wished to see. They traveled by easy stages, pausing to admire what was worth admiring along the way, the great houses, the parks, the particular beauties of hill and dale that Mrs. Gardiner, who had spent part of her girlhood in the county, pointed out with the pleasure of remembered familiarity, until, drawing near at last to the little town of Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner had formerly resided, her aunt proposed, almost as an afterthought, a visit to a great house some 5 miles distant, a place called Pemberley, whose park, she had heard, was reckoned among the finest in the country. Elizabeth's composure faltered at the name, for she knew well enough whose house it was, and hesitated, unwilling to trust herself so near a place so intimately connected with the man whose memory still troubled her more than she cared to acknowledge. But upon making careful inquiry of the chambermaid at their inn, and learning with relief that the family was from home for the summer, she consented, her curiosity overcoming her reluctance, and the following morning saw their carriage turning in at Pemberley's gates. The park was very large and contained great variety of ground, and they entered it at one of its lowest points, driving for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent, Elizabeth's spirits too full for conversation, until, as the road wound gradually upward and then began to descend, the house itself came suddenly into view across a valley, a large, handsome building of warm stone, standing well on rising ground, backed by a ridge of high woody hills, and in front, a stream of some natural importance swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance, its banks neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste, and she gazed upon it with an admiration that, in that moment, she scarcely tried to conceal, thinking, with a small private pang she could not entirely suppress, that to be mistress of Pemberley might indeed be something. They were admitted to the house by the housekeeper, a respectable-looking elderly woman named Mrs. Reynolds, who conducted them through rooms lofty and handsome, furnished in a style corresponding with the fortune of their proprietor, and who spoke, as they went, of her master with a warmth and sincerity that struck Elizabeth with real surprise, praising his kindness to his tenants and servants, his generosity, his gentleness of temper, in terms so far removed from the proud, cold figure Elizabeth had once believed him to be that she found herself listening with an attention she had not expected to give. "He is the best landlord, and the best master," said Mrs. Reynolds, "that ever lived. Not like the wild young men nowadays, who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants or servants but what will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men." They paused before a gallery of family portraits, and Mrs. Reynolds pointed out one in particular, a likeness of Mr. Darcy himself, taken some years before, remarking that he had just such a smile upon his face when he looked at anybody. And Elizabeth stood before the painted image for some minutes, studying features she had once thought merely proud, and finding in them now, with the housekeeper's testimony fresh in her ears, something she had perhaps too readily overlooked, a countenance capable, she began to allow, of a gentler expression than she had ever been permitted to witness. It was as they walked out afterward into the grounds, admiring the gardens that sloped away toward the river, that Elizabeth, turning a corner of the path, found herself, with a shock that stopped her breath entirely, face to face with Mr. Darcy himself. Arrived unexpectedly a day before his household had looked for him. The surprise on both sides was total. Darcy started, visibly, color rushing to his face and then receding, and for a moment neither could speak, but he recovered himself with a swiftness that astonished her, greeting her with a civility so warm, so entirely without the coldness or resentment she had steeled herself to expect, that Elizabeth scarcely knew how to answer him. He inquired after her family with evident sincerity, asked after her journey, and then, in a manner she found still more remarkable, requested the honor of introducing his sister, who was even now at Pemberley and would, he hoped, have the pleasure of her acquaintance before she left the neighborhood. He was, in every particular, a changed man from the one she had parted from at Hunsford, his manner gentle, his conversation easy, his attention to her aunt and uncle, whom she had feared he might treat with the very condescension she most dreaded on their account, marked instead by a warmth and courtesy that left her, by the time they returned to there in that evening, in a state of confusion she could not begin to untangle. He called upon them the following day, bringing his sister with him, a tall, shy young woman, not yet 17, whose gentle, unassuming manner and evident eagerness to please bore no resemblance to the proud, accomplished paragon Elizabeth had half expected, and whose obvious affection for her brother, and his evident tenderness toward her, spoke of a family bond far warmer than Elizabeth had ever supposed the Darcy household to contain. The days that followed brought further meetings, an invitation to dine at Pemberley, walks about the grounds, Georgiana's shy attempts at conversation growing gradually more confident under Elizabeth's easy encouragement, Darcy's attentions to the gardeners so consistently kind and unaffected that Mr. Gardiner remarked, more than once, that he had never met with a more gentlemanlike young man, wondering privately, as did his wife, whether some particular understanding might not exist or might not soon come to exist between their niece and so eligible a host. Elizabeth herself scarcely knew what to make of her own feelings, aware only that the anger and prejudice that had governed her opinion of Darcy for so long had been entirely, and rather bewilderingly, dismantled, replaced by a regard she was not yet ready to name, but could no longer pretend did not exist. It was on a morning that had begun in all the tranquil pleasure of these new understandings, Elizabeth seated in the parlor of the inn at Lambton, having just parted from Georgiana and her brother after a visit of unusual warmth, turning over in her mind the particular kindness of his manner toward her that morning, that the post brought 2 letters from Jane, the second written in evident haste and agitation, its contents striking Elizabeth with a horror that drove every other thought from her mind entirely. Lydia was gone. She had left Brighton in the dead of night, in company with Mr. Wickham, and though the first letter had spoken only of an elopement, hastily assumed by the family to be bound for Scotland and a marriage there, the second, written hours later in a hand scarcely legible with distress, reported the dreadful likelihood, conveyed by Colonel Forster himself, that no such marriage was ever intended, that Wickham had left considerable debts of honor behind him at Brighton, and that his object in fleeing with Lydia was feared to be very far removed from matrimony. Jane's letter begged for her uncle's immediate assistance, for their father was gone to London already in pursuit, and the family at Longbourn was in such distress as words could scarcely convey. Elizabeth read the letters through once and then again, her hands shaking so violently that the paper rattled, every feature of color draining from her face, and she had scarcely mastered enough composure to ring for help when the door opened and Mr. Darcy himself entered, come to inquire, with his usual gentle solicitude, after her health, and found her instead in a condition so altered from that in which he had left her not an hour before that he started forward in genuine alarm. "Good God! What is the matter?" he asked, and Elizabeth, past all power of concealment now, past all thought of what construction he might place upon her family's disgrace, told him the whole. Lydia gone, Wickham's character now laid bare beyond any doubt. The ruin that threatened not only her sister, but the reputation of every Bennet daughter, herself included, should the truth become known. "I must go to my uncle directly," she said, rising in an agony of urgency, her voice breaking despite every effort at composure. "There is not an instant to lose." Darcy said little, but what he said was spoken with a gravity and an evident depth of feeling on her behalf that told Elizabeth, even amid the wreck of her present distress, that whatever hope she might once have entertained of a future with him was likely now, by this fresh disgrace attached to her family's name, closed to her forever, and it was with this new grief pressing upon the old that she hastened to find her aunt and uncle, to hurry their departure, to begin, without a moment's further delay, the journey back toward Longbourn and whatever ruin or rescue awaited them there. The carriage rattled out through Pemberley's great gates and onto the turnpike road with a speed that betrayed, in every jolt and sway, the urgency that had seized the whole party, and Elizabeth sat rigid against the cushions, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the passing hedgerows without truly seeing them, her mind circling, again and again, over the few dreadful lines of Jane's letter until the words seemed to beat against her skull in time with the horse's hoofs. Mrs. Gardiner, seated beside her, held her niece's cold hand within her own, saying little, for there was little that could be said, and Mr. Gardiner, opposite them, occupied himself with calculating the swiftest road to London, and thence to Longbourn, his brow drawn into lines of grave concentration that Elizabeth had never before seen upon so equable a countenance. They travelled through the remainder of that day and long into the night, changing horses at posting inns with a haste that left the ostlers staring, pausing only for the barest necessities of rest, until at last, worn with fatigue and dread in equal measure, they came within sight of Longbourn's familiar chimneys, rising pale against a grey morning sky heavy with the threat of rain. The house, when they reached it, wore an aspect Elizabeth had never known it to wear before, the curtains half drawn, the servants moving about their duties with hushed and anxious faces, and Jane, running out to meet the carriage before it had properly stopped, threw herself into her sister's arms with a depth of relief and grief so entwined that for some moments neither could speak a coherent word. "Is there any news?" Elizabeth managed at last, drawing back to search her sister's pale, exhausted face. "None that gives us comfort," Jane answered, her voice unsteady. "Our father is still in London and writes only that nothing certain has yet been discovered." "Oh, Lizzie, I have hardly slept these 3 nights for thinking of it." They went in together and found Mrs. Bennet confined to her room in a state of nervous collapse so complete that she could speak of nothing but her own suffering, declaring by turns that she should die of the shame of it, that Colonel Forster ought to be horsewhipped for his negligence, and that if only someone would go to Brighton and challenge Wickham to a duel, all might yet be set right, a confusion of grief and self-pity that left her daughters little inclined to seek comfort from her, and drove them instead to lean upon one another and upon their aunt, whose calm good sense proved, in those anxious days, an anchor for the whole household. Mr. Gardiner, losing no time, set out again for London within a few hours of his arrival, determined to join his brother-in-law in whatever search might yet be undertaken, and it was from London, over the days that followed, that the family received such intelligence as there was to be had letters from Mr. Bennet, brief and uncharacteristically without any trace of his habitual irony, reporting that he had traced the couple's movements as far as a certain inn upon the road, but no further, that no one seemed to know where they had gone from there, and that he intended to continue making what inquiries he could, though he confessed himself at a loss how to proceed. Mr. Gardiner's letters, when they came, were fuller and more reassuring in tone, promising that every effort was being made, that his brother must not despair, and urging the family at Longbourn to keep up their spirits as best they could. It was a period of the most trying uncertainty, and Elizabeth, watching her father when he at last returned briefly to Longbourn, worn and grey with an anxiety he could no longer disguise beneath his customary dry wit, felt for the first time in her life a full measure of tenderness toward his failings as well as his virtues, understanding, as she had perhaps never fully understood before, how much of the present calamity had its roots in a parental indulgence too easy, too little inclined to correction, that had left Lydia to grow up wild and unchecked, certain that her own wishes were law, and armed with neither the caution nor the principle that might have preserved her from so ruinous a step. "I have been a negligent father," Mr. Bennet said to Elizabeth one evening, in a rare moment of unguarded feeling, as they sat together in the library where so many of their private conversations had passed in easier times. "I have let things take their own course and been indolent and philosophical about it, when I ought to have exerted myself. It is a lesson I feel most bitterly now, though I fear I feel it too late to be of any use to Lydia." Elizabeth could offer him no comfort that did not sound hollow even to her own ears, and they sat some while in a silence heavier than any that had passed between them before, until Mr. Bennet, rousing himself with something of his old spirit, declared that he would not be made more wretched by dwelling upon it, and that it would pass, as such things generally did, one way or another. It was some days after this that Mr. Gardiner's letters brought, at last, the news the whole family had scarcely dared to hope for. The couple had been discovered lodging under a false pretense of marriage in a quarter of London not generally frequented by persons of respectability, and though Wickham had at first shown every disposition to avoid the responsibility his conduct demanded, professing debts too pressing to permit an immediate marriage, and speaking with a carelessness of Lydia's reputation that revealed, in the plainest terms, the true shallowness of his character, a settlement had nevertheless been reached, and the marriage was to take place without further delay. The precise terms of that settlement were not, in the first instance, disclosed to the ladies at Longbourn, save that Mr. Gardiner had undertaken to clear Wickham's debts, said to amount to a sum considerably beyond what so young a man ought properly to have incurred, and had further arranged for him a small allowance and a commission in a regiment stationed in the north, a solution that satisfied the immediate necessity of preserving Lydia's reputation, however little it addressed the deeper improvidence of the match itself. Mrs. Bennet, upon receiving this intelligence, was transported at once from the depths of despair to the heights of triumphant joy, declaring that she had known all along that everything would end happily, that she must have some wedding clothes sent for immediately, and that she could not wait to see her dear Lydia married, entirely losing sight, in her raptures, of the very real disgrace that had so nearly overtaken them all. Mr. Bennet's own relief, though real, was tempered by a grimmer humor, and when the question arose of whether Lydia and her new husband should be received at Longbourn following the ceremony, he declared, with something of his old dryness restored, that he would as soon see them at Newcastle as have them plaguing his own house, though upon his wife's tearful insistence, and out of a natural if reluctant affection for his youngest daughter, he consented at last to their coming for a short visit. Before Wickham's regiment claimed him, it was Elizabeth's private conversations with her Aunt Gardiner, in the quiet weeks that followed, that at last unravelled the true history of how the marriage had been secured, for it had not escaped Elizabeth's notice that a settlement so generous, arranged so swiftly, sat oddly with what she knew of her uncle's more modest means, and she pressed her aunt, gently but persistently, for the particulars that had been kept from her. Mrs. Gardiner, after some hesitation, and only upon Elizabeth's earnest assurance of absolute secrecy, at last disclosed the truth, that it had not been Mr. Gardiner alone who had discovered the fugitive pair, nor Mr. Gardiner's purse alone that had cleared Wickham's debts and purchased his commission, but Mr. Darcy himself, who had traced the couple through his own exertions, called upon Wickham in person, endured interviews of the most disagreeable kind to negotiate terms, and paid, from his own pocket, every sum necessary to bring about the marriage, undertaking the whole business, moreover, with an express and earnest desire that no word of his involvement should ever reach Longbourn, or Elizabeth in particular. Elizabeth received this intelligence in a silence so profound that her aunt looked at her with some alarm, uncertain how the news would be taken. But the stillness that had come over Elizabeth was not distress, but a species of overwhelming feeling too large and too complicated for immediate expression, gratitude, astonishment, a fresh and painful understanding of a generosity exercised entirely without hope of acknowledgment or reward undertaken. She could not now doubt, for her own sake as much as for the sake of a family connection, he had every reason, after the humiliation she had dealt him at Hunsford, to wish to see disgraced rather than saved. "He did it all for us," she said softly, when at last she could speak, "and would have us never know it." "He was most earnest," said Mrs. Gardiner, watching her niece's face with careful attention, "that his name should not be mentioned. I believe he felt himself in some measure to blame for Wickham's being suffered to move freely in society, since he alone knew the full extent of his character, and might have exposed him sooner." Elizabeth said little more upon the subject that evening, but she carried the knowledge with her through the days that followed like a private and precious weight, turning it over in solitary hours, and finding, each time she examined it, that her regard for Darcy, already growing before this fresh proof of his goodness, had deepened now into something she could no longer pretend to mistake for mere gratitude alone. Lydia and Wickham came to Longbourn, as had been agreed, for a short visit before his regiment carried them north, and Lydia's manner upon her arrival astonished even those who knew her best. She descended from the carriage in the highest spirits imaginable, laughing, talking without pause, entirely without shame or consciousness of the anxiety she had caused, eager only to display her wedding ring and to claim, with the particular self-satisfaction of the very young, the precedence now due to her as a married woman above her elder, unmarried sisters. She spoke of Brighton, of the wedding, of her husband's charms, with a carelessness that betrayed no understanding whatsoever of how near she had come to ruin, and it was in the course of one such unguarded ramble that she let slip, quite by accident, a remark that struck Elizabeth with the force of sudden revelation. "Only think of its being Mr. Darcy who was at my wedding," Lydia said, describing the ceremony with careless enthusiasm. "La! I quite forgot I was not to mention it. Wickham made me promise so faithfully. What will they say?" Elizabeth, seizing at once upon this confirmation of what her aunt had already disclosed, wrote directly to Mrs. Gardiner, begging leave to know the whole story now that its secrecy had been so carelessly broken by Lydia's own indiscretion, and received in return a fuller account than before of Darcy's search through London, his discovery of Wickham's lodging through a former acquaintance, the difficult interviews in which he had brought that reluctant gentleman to see the necessity of marriage, and the settlement finally concluded, all conducted, her aunt assured her, with a delicacy and a determination that spoke of feelings far exceeding mere obligation. It was not long after Lydia's departure for the north with her new husband that the neighborhood was set astir by news of a very different kind. Mr. Bingley was returning to Netherfield. The intelligence, brought first by a servant's gossip and confirmed within days by Bingley's own arrival, threw Mrs. Bennet into transports scarcely less violent than those occasioned by Lydia's marriage, and she could speak of nothing else. Certain that his return could mean but one thing, and impatient for the visit she felt sure must follow. Jane, for her part, received the news with an outward composure that Elizabeth, watching more closely than anyone, could see cost her sister a very considerable effort, her color rising and falling by turns, her hands occupied with needlework she scarcely seemed to see. Bingley called at Longbourn within days of his arrival, and Elizabeth observed, with mingled apprehension and hope, that he came not alone, but in company with Mr. Darcy, a circumstance that threw her own composure into some disorder, for she had not looked to see him so soon, nor in her own home, nor under the curious and not always discreet observation of her mother and younger sisters. The visit passed with a stiffness that surprised no one who understood the history between the two families gathered in that small drawing-room. Bingley's manner toward Jane, though warm, carried a diffidence born of the long separation and the uncertainty of his reception, while Jane, striving with all her gentle art to appear merely cordial, betrayed by every unconscious blush and hesitation the depth of feeling she could not entirely master. Darcy, for his part, said little, sitting somewhat apart, his eyes seeking Elizabeth's more often than propriety strictly allowed, though when their glances met he looked quickly away, as though uncertain of his own reception or unwilling to presume upon it. Mrs. Bennet's civilities toward Bingley, effusive and unguarded, were matched by a chill, scarcely concealed resentment toward Darcy, whom she had never forgiven for his supposed pride at the Meryton assembly so many months before. And Elizabeth sat through the whole visit in an agony of mortification on behalf of manners she could neither excuse nor correct, wondering, with real anxiety, what construction Darcy must place upon a household that seemed determined to expose its worst features before him at every opportunity. Yet the visit was but the first of many, for Bingley called again within days, and again after that, each visit finding Jane a little more at her ease, a little more willing to let her true feelings show through the reserve she had cultivated so carefully through months of disappointment. And it was on one such visit, when Bingley had contrived with more art than he generally displayed, to draw Mrs. Bennet and the younger girls from the room upon some pretext of admiring the shrubbery, that he at last found himself alone with Jane, and spoke the words that both had so long hoped and so long feared never to hear. He returned to the room some while later with a countenance so radiant with happiness that Mrs. Bennet, glancing up from her needlework, required no further intelligence to guess what had passed, and the moment Jane, following him in, caught her mother's eye, the whole truth was confirmed. Bingley had proposed, and Jane had accepted him. Mrs. Bennet's raptures upon receiving this news exceeded, if such a thing were possible, even her earlier transports over Lydia's marriage, for here at last was the match she had so long and so ardently desired. Secured moreover to a young man of real fortune and real amiability, and she could not cease from declaring her joy, her certainty that she had always known how it would end, her eagerness to discuss wedding clothes, settlements, and the disposition of Netherfield's household, until Mr. Bennet, entering the room to find his wife in such a state of delighted incoherence, was obliged to inquire of Jane herself what had occurred, and received her quiet, blushing confirmation with a warmth of feeling he did not trouble to disguise. "I am extremely glad," he told her, taking her hand. "You will be very happy together. Your tempers are by no means unlike. You are each of you so complying that nothing will ever be resolved on, so easy that every servant will cheat you, and so generous that you will always exceed your income." It was spoken half in jest, in his usual style, but there was real tenderness beneath it, and Jane, kissing her father's cheek, could not remember a time when she had felt more entirely happy. Elizabeth's own joy in her sister's engagement was unclouded and complete, and yet she could not but be conscious, in the weeks that followed, of a certain awkwardness in her own situation. For though Bingley's visits now brought Darcy to Longbourn with a regularity that gave her many opportunities of observing him, she found him changed once more from the easy, attentive manner he had shown at Pemberley, grown reserved again, watchful, as though uncertain of his welcome, and she began to fear, with a dismay that surprised her by its intensity, that the feelings he had once professed to her at Hunsford might have cooled, or been extinguished altogether by all that had since passed between their families. It was in the midst of this uncertainty that an event occurred which was to precipitate, in ways none could have anticipated, the very resolution Elizabeth scarcely dared to hope for. One morning, as the family sat at breakfast, the sound of a carriage drawing up before the house sent Kitty running to the window, and she announced, with some surprise, the arrival of a lady in a carriage none of them recognized, drawn by 4 horses and attended with a state that spoke of considerable consequence. The visitor, admitted a few minutes later, proved to be no less a personage than Lady Catherine de Bourgh herself, who entered the room with an air of even greater hauteur than her rank generally commanded, acknowledged the family's astonished civilities with the barest inclination of her head, and requested, in a tone that admitted no possibility of refusal, a private conference with Miss Elizabeth Bennet alone. Elizabeth, mystified and not a little apprehensive, led her ladyship out into the garden, where the shrubbery afforded some privacy from the house, and there Lady Catherine, without any preamble of civility, launched at once into the object of her visit. She had heard, she declared, a report she trusted, indeed she was determined, must prove entirely false, that Elizabeth was on the point of forming an engagement with her nephew, Mr. Darcy, and she had come, without delay, to have the matter contradicted from Elizabeth's own lips. If you believed it impossible to be true, Elizabeth replied, with a composure that cost her some effort but did not waver, I wonder you took the trouble of coming so far. What could your ladyship propose by it? At once to insist upon having such a report universally contradicted. Your coming to Longbourn to see me and my family will be rather a confirmation of it, if, indeed, such a report is in existence. Lady Catherine's countenance darkened, and she pressed her point with mounting vehemence, declaring the match, should it ever be contemplated, a scandalous violation of the understanding long existing between her nephew and her own daughter, Miss de Bourgh, to whom he had been destined from the cradle by the mutual wishes of their families, and demanding, with an imperiousness that brooked no contradiction, that Elizabeth give her word never to enter into such an engagement. I am not to be intimidated into anything so wholly unreasonable, said Elizabeth, her own spirit rising to meet the challenge, though she kept her voice steady and her manner civil. Your ladyship wants Mr. Darcy to marry your daughter, but would my giving you the wished-for promise make their marriage at all more probable? Supposing him to be attached to me, would my refusing to accept his hand make him wish to bestow it on his cousin? Allow me to say, Lady Catherine, that the arguments with which you have supported this extraordinary application have been as frivolous as the application was ill-judged. I have every reason in the world to think ill of you, cried Lady Catherine, her composure entirely abandoned now to real anger. Do not deceive yourself into a belief that I will ever recede. I came to try you. I hope to find you reasonable, but depend upon it, I will carry my point. And I certainly never shall give it. I am not to be alarmed by anything your ladyship may say. If you have any further objection to make, pray let me hear it at once, and let us have done with the subject forever. They parted at last with no resolution, Lady Catherine's carriage rolling away in high dudgeon, her indignation entirely unappeased, while Elizabeth, returning to the house with a heart still beating fast from the encounter, found herself unable to give any but the vaguest account of the interview to her curious mother, and retired soon after to think over, in the privacy of her own room, all that had passed, wondering, with a hope she scarcely dared examine, what report of the marriage Lady Catherine could have heard, and from whom, and whether the very persistence of the rumor might not carry within it some grain of truth she had not yet permitted herself to fully credit. Lady Catherine, true to her nature, did not let the matter rest, but travelled directly to her nephew, and laid before him, with every circumstance of Elizabeth's obstinacy, the whole account of the interview, intending, no doubt, to enlist his own pride against so unsuitable a connection, and to secure, by his own mouth, the very repudiation Elizabeth had refused to give. But the effect of her ladyship's report was very far from what she had designed, for Darcy, hearing of Elizabeth's steady refusal to promise what his aunt demanded, felt his heart leap with a hope he had scarcely dared to entertain since Hunsford. For if Elizabeth had been entirely indifferent to him, surely she would have given the promise readily enough, and thought no more of it, that she had refused, and refused with spirit, suggested, to a man now willing to read her conduct with more generosity than his pride had once permitted, that her feelings toward him might not, after all, be so immovably fixed in dislike as her words at Hunsford had once declared them. It was with this fragile hope newly kindled that Darcy came again to Longbourn, some days later, in company with Bingley, ostensibly upon the ordinary business of the coming wedding, but with an evident restlessness in his manner that Elizabeth, watching him across the drawing-room, could not help but notice. When the party set out, as had become their habit, upon a walk through the lanes about Longbourn, it happened, whether by chance or by Elizabeth's own gentle contrivance, that she and Darcy found themselves walking somewhat apart from the others, the September air mild about them, the hedgerows heavy with the last blackberries of the season, the fields beyond stretching gold and stubbled toward a sky of high, thin cloud. For some minutes they walked in silence, each conscious of the other's nearness and neither quite able to begin what both, in their separate ways, had come to say. And it was Elizabeth, at last, who broke the silence, resolved that gratitude at least must be spoken. Whatever else remained unsaid. "Mr. Darcy," she began, her voice not quite steady, "I must thank you. I know now what you did for my sister. I know the pains and humiliation it must have cost you, and I cannot let it pass without expressing, however inadequately, the gratitude of my whole family, my own gratitude most particularly." Darcy stopped walking and turned to look at her with an intensity that made her own breath catch. "If you will thank me," he said, "lo, let it be for yourself alone. That the wish of giving happiness to you might add force to the other inducements which led me on, I shall not attempt to deny. But your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you." Elizabeth found she could not speak at once, her heart too full, and Darcy, taking her silence for encouragement rather than confusion, pressed on, his composure breaking at last into something more urgent and unguarded than she had ever seen him show. "My affections and wishes are unchanged," he said, "but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." Elizabeth, feeling all the awkwardness of the moment, and yet unable to bear his uncertainty a moment longer, made herself understood as soon as she could bring her voice to obey her. Assuring him that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded that she received with gratitude and with pleasure his present assurances, and the happiness that spread across his countenance at these words was, she thought afterward, unlike anything she had ever seen him express before, not the composed satisfaction of a man whose wishes have been gratified, but the unguarded, almost boyish joy of a man who had scarcely dared to hope, and found his hope exceeded. They walked on together, then, for a great while, the others of the party quite forgotten, and spoke at last of all that had passed between them, Darcy confessing the mortification he had felt at her refusal at Hunsford, and the gratitude he now bore her for the very reproofs that had, in the months since, taught him to examine and correct a pride he had never before thought himself guilty of, Elizabeth confessing, in her turn, her own mortification at having been so entirely deceived by Wickham, and so unjust in her first opinion of Darcy himself, and the slow, painful process by which the letter at Hunsford, and afterward the evidence of her own eyes at Pemberley, had taught her to see him truly. "I have been a selfish being all my life," Darcy told her, as they paused beneath the shade of an old oak at the turning of the lane, "in practice, though not in principle. As a child I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled." "Let us not go back to that period," Elizabeth said gently, smiling now through the emotion that had gathered in her throat. "The recollection of what I then said, of my conduct, my manners, my expressions during the whole of it, is now, and has been many months, inexpressibly painful to me. Your reproof, so well applied, I shall never forget, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. Those were your words. You know not, you can scarcely conceive, how they have tortured me, though it was many months before I was reasonable enough to allow their justice." "I was not too proud to say I was wrong," said Darcy, taking her hand, "and let me only add, once more, that I could not have imagined so great a change possible." They returned to the house at last, arm in arm, and though nothing was said openly before the rest of the party, Jane, catching her sister's eye across the drawing-room, saw at once, in the particular brightness of Elizabeth's countenance, that something of great moment had passed, and it was to Jane alone, that same evening, once the household had retired, that Elizabeth confided the whole, her sister's astonishment giving way by slow degrees to a joy as complete and unguarded as any Elizabeth had ever witnessed in her. "Are you quite serious?" Jane asked again and again, unable at first to credit so complete a reversal of every opinion Elizabeth had ever expressed of the gentleman. "Oh, Lizzie, is it true? Can you really love him?" "I have loved him, I believe, for longer than I dared admit even to myself," Elizabeth confessed. "It crept upon me so gradually that I hardly know when it began, but I know that I am to be the happiest creature in the world." It remained only for the engagement to be made known to their father, a task Elizabeth undertook with some trepidation, aware that Mr. Bennet's opinion of Darcy, formed chiefly through the report of his proud manner at Meryton and his cold interference between Bingley and Jane, was not likely to receive the news with immediate enthusiasm. She found him alone in his library, and told him, without preamble, that Mr. Darcy had renewed his addresses, and that she had accepted him. Mr. Bennet looked up from his book in genuine astonishment. "Lizzie," he said, "are you out of your senses, to be accepting this man? Have you not always hated him?" "I had, indeed, a very poor opinion of him once," Elizabeth admitted, "but I have come to know him better, Papa, and to understand how greatly I was mistaken. He is truly a good man, generous, honorable, and I love him. He is rich, to be sure, and you may have more fine clothes and fine carriages than Jane. But will they make you happy?" "Have you any other objection?" Elizabeth asked, smiling despite the earnestness of the moment, "than your belief of my indifference?" "None at all. We all know him to be a proud, unpleasant sort of man, but this would be nothing if you really liked him." I do like him," Elizabeth said, and finding that mere assurance did not satisfy her father's evident concern for her happiness, she went on to speak, with a warmth that left no doubt of her sincerity, of all Darcy had done for Lydia, all he had suffered at her own hands and forgiven, all the goodness she had come to see beneath a reserve that had once seemed to her nothing but pride. Mr. Bennet, hearing this fuller account, and observing in his daughter's face a happiness he could not mistake for anything but genuine, gave his consent at last with a tenderness that broke through his habitual irony. "Well, my dear," he said, "if this be the case, he deserves you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less worthy." It fell to Elizabeth, too, to make the news known to her mother, a task she approached with considerably more apprehension than she had felt before her father. Uncertain how Mrs. Bennet's long-standing resentment of Mr. Darcy's pride might be reconciled with the news of so brilliant a match, but she need not have feared, for the moment the words were out that Mr. Darcy, 10,000 a year, was to marry her daughter, every prior objection vanished utterly from Mrs. Bennet's mind, replaced at once by transports of joy so violent that she could scarcely sit still in her chair, declaring that she had always liked him prodigiously, that she had known all along there was something particular in his manner, that she must go to Meryton directly to share the happy news, and calculating aloud, with unconcealed delight, the pin money, the jewels, and the carriages that must now attend her second daughter's elevated situation. The autumn weeks that followed passed in the particular flurried happiness of a household preparing for not one wedding but two, Longbourn's rooms filled with the bustle of dressmakers and the constant arrival of correspondence. Mrs. Bennet in a state of nearly continuous felicity, Kitty basking in the reflected glory of her sister's triumphs and beginning, under Jane and Elizabeth's gentle influence and removed now from Lydia's corrupting example, to show signs of a steadiness of character no one had thought to look for in her, Mary continuing much as before, absorbed in her books and her music, content in her own quiet way to remain the plainest and most serious of the sisters, unmoved by matrimonial excitement that did not touch her own concerns. Bingley and Darcy called daily, the two friends now bound together by a double connection that pleased them both extremely, and the growing intimacy between the two engaged couples brought with it, too, a fuller reconciliation between Elizabeth and Darcy's own family. Georgiana, informed of her brother's engagement by letter, wrote to Elizabeth with a warmth and eagerness that spoke of real joy at the prospect of a sister so near her own age and so unlike the cold, formal relations she had perhaps feared to gain, and looked forward, she confessed, to loving Elizabeth as well as her brother already did. Lady Catherine, informed of the engagement in due course, did not at first condescend to acknowledge it by so much as a letter, and it was some while before any communication passed between Rosings and the newly connected families. But Darcy, unwilling to see so considerable a breach persist within his own relations, wrote to his aunt with a firmness he had perhaps never before employed toward her, laying before her the settled nature of his happiness and his hope that she would, in time, be brought to see the wisdom of his choice. And though her ladyship's first reply was couched in terms of considerable asperity, the passage of time, and perhaps some curiosity to see for herself the woman who had so thoroughly overturned her expectations, worked gradually upon her resentment, until she condescended, some months after the marriage had taken place, to pay a visit to Pemberley herself, and visit Elizabeth received with a composed civility that gradually won, if not her ladyship's warm approval, at least a grudging acknowledgment that her nephew's wife possessed both spirit and sense enough to be born. The wedding day, when it came at last, brought together at Longbourn Church a company as various in its feelings as any that had ever assembled beneath its modest steeple, Mrs. Bennet radiant with a happiness so complete that she scarcely knew how to contain it, declaring to every acquaintance she could corner that she had 2 daughters married, and married so well that she could ask nothing further of Providence. Mr. Bennet, watching his 2 eldest and dearest daughters exchange their vows, with an expression that mingled pride and a certain wistful tenderness he did not trouble to hide, Jane and Bingley radiant in a happiness so evidently mutual and so long anticipated that even the most severe observer could find nothing in their union but cause for rejoicing, and Elizabeth, standing before the altar in her simple wedding dress, turning to find Darcy's eyes already upon her with an expression of such open, unguarded tenderness that she felt, in that moment, the last shadow of doubt or awkwardness that had ever stood between them dissolve entirely away. They were married on the same day, the 2 ceremonies performed within the hour, and the wedding breakfast that followed at Longbourn was attended with all the noise and gaiety that so joyful an occasion demanded. Mrs. Bennet presiding over the table with a satisfaction so entire that she scarcely touched her own plate for talking, while Mr. Gardiner and his wife, whose kindness had first opened the way to so much of the happiness now being celebrated, looked on with a quiet satisfaction of their own, aware, better than anyone present save Elizabeth herself, how great a part their own summer excursion into Derbyshire had played in bringing about so happy a conclusion. Bingley and Jane settled at Netherfield for a 12-month, near enough to Longbourn that Jane and Elizabeth might visit one another with the frequency their attachment demanded, though it was understood between the sisters, and confirmed within the year, that so near a neighbourhood to Mrs. Bennet's incessant visits and Mrs. Phillips's endless gossip could not answer for a permanent home, and the couple removed, in due course, to an estate in a neighbouring county, near enough to Pemberley that the 2 sisters, so long inseparable, need not be parted by any great distance after all. Elizabeth's removal to Pemberley brought with it a change of situation so complete that she could scarcely, in her early months there, accustom herself to the grandeur of her new home without some private amusement at the distance travelled since those first proud words exchanged at the Meryton Assembly, but she settled into her new life with a natural grace that won, within a very short time, the affection of the household, the tenants, and the neighbourhood at large, her wit and liveliness softening, wherever she went, the more formal manners that had so long characterized Pemberley's mistressless establishment. Georgiana, welcomed into an intimacy with her new sister that exceeded even her most hopeful expectations, learned from Elizabeth's example a freedom of manner and spirit she had never before dared to exhibit, the 2 young women growing, over the following months and years, into a friendship as close as any that existed between the sisters at Longbourn. Kitty, freed from Lydia's corrupting influence and much improved by the more rational society she found in the company of her elder sisters, whom she visited frequently both at Pemberley and at the estate Bingley and Jane came to occupy, grew steadily in sense and steadiness as the years advanced, losing, by degrees, the flightiness that had once made her scarcely distinguishable from her youngest sister, and became, in time, a young woman of real if unremarkable merit. Mary, remaining longest at home with her parents, found herself compelled, now that she was no longer the plainest among 5 sisters all thrown constantly together, into rather more society than she had ever sought, and bore the change. If without any great enthusiasm, at least with a philosophical resignation not unbecoming to her studious character. Lydia and Wickham's marriage, for its part, proved every bit as unstable and improvident as those who knew them best had feared it must. Wickham's affection, never very deep, cooled steadily with time, while Lydia's own attachment, equally shallow, found its consolation in whatever amusement presented itself. And the pair moved from quarter to quarter as his debts and his restlessness required, seldom remaining long anywhere and looking, with a regularity that tried even Elizabeth's patience, to their more fortunate relations for such small sums as might ease their perpetual difficulties, assistance that Elizabeth and Jane, out of a family affection that survived every disappointment, continued quietly to provide, though never so generously as to encourage the very improvidence they sought to relieve. Mrs. Bennet, in the years that followed, remained as she had always been, delighting in the visits of her married daughters, boasting of her connections to whomever would listen, her nerves undiminished by the settled comfort of her situation, while Mr. Bennet, missing his cleverest daughter's company more than he confessed even to himself, found compensation in visiting Pemberley with a frequency that surprised his wife, who had never supposed him fond enough of travel to undertake such journeys, but who could not persuade herself, whatever the inconvenience, to accompany him, preferring the more familiar comforts of her own drawing-room and the society of Meryton to the grandeur, however agreeable, of her daughter's northern establishment. The Gardiners, whose affection and good sense had first brought Elizabeth into Derbyshire and thus, however unknowingly, into the path of her own happiness, remained ever after among the most cherished friends of both the Darcy and Bingley households, welcomed at Pemberley with a warmth that acknowledged, though it never spoke openly of, the great debt of gratitude owed to their kindness, and it was Mrs. Gardiner, more than any other, in whom Elizabeth continued to confide, through all the years of her marriage, the particular happiness of a union that had begun in misunderstanding and pride and grown, through patient correction on both sides, into an affection as deep and as settled as any that had ever bound 2 hearts together. Of Darcy himself, time only confirmed what Elizabeth had come to know of him in those last months before their marriage, that beneath the reserve which had once seemed to her mere arrogance lay a nature of true generosity, steady principle, and a capacity for deep and lasting affection that revealed itself most fully not in the great gestures he had made on Lydia's behalf, though these were remembered and honored within the family circle for as long as any of them lived, but in the quiet, daily tenderness of ordinary married life, in his patience with her father's teasing, his warmth toward her mother despite every provocation to impatience, his evident delight in his sister's happiness at finding, in Elizabeth, the friend and companion she had so long wanted, and above all in the easy, laughing intimacy that grew between himself and his wife, an intimacy in which Elizabeth's wit, once the very thing that had provoked his reluctant admiration against his own judgment, now formed the daily delight and constant amusement of his life. They lived, in the years that followed, in a happiness neither had thought possible in those early days of Pride and Prejudice on either side, Elizabeth mistress of Pemberley, her laughter ringing through rooms that had once seemed to her, on that first curious visit with her aunt and uncle, almost too grand for any ordinary happiness to inhabit, Darcy himself grown gentler, more open, more inclined to laugh at his own former faults than he had ever imagined a man of his pride could become, and, between them, a marriage built at last upon the truest of foundations, not the deference of interest, nor the vanity of a first attraction, but a hard-won understanding of each other's true character, tested and proved through misunderstanding, humiliation, and the slow, patient correction of faults on both sides, until at last 2 hearts that might so easily have parted forever in mutual dislike, found instead, in each other, the deepest happiness either had ever known.